total number, the participants, and they are all joining us virtually from their headquarters or base stations. I would also take this opportunity, dear participants, to introduce our esteemed resource person, Dr. Mohammad Faradinia. He has completed his DPhil in zoology from the University of Oxford in 2017. He is currently a research fellow at the Department of Zoology at the University of Oxford, as I earlier mentioned. His research focus on analytical methods to improve understanding of wider factors affecting biodiversity conservation, largely of megafauna in West and Central Asia, considering environmental resources and cross-border conservation, with the goal of leveraging biodiversity conservation in this region of the world. He is a member of several international consortium and has published several research papers in the high impact factor journals of international repute. With this brief profile, I would now request Dr. Mohammad to please start his presentation. Over to you.
Thank you. Thank you for inviting me. Can you hear me properly?
Yeah, perfect.
Okay. So today we will be discussing about transboundary conservation, and it's an emerging field in conservation science. And first of all, we need to understand the concepts, challenges, and opportunities we have in transboundary conservation. And I started my presentation with a photo of a tiger at the border between India and Bhutan. So it shows that one of the most important transboundary population for a large cat in the world. So there are 4 objectives for this talk. So the first one is transboundary conservation as an emerging field for global environmental policy. So what is that? Then we will go to find the definition and typology of different types of transboundary conservation. Then a brief story about transboundary conservation and what are the existing international treaties and conventions in terms of international law for transboundary conservation. So first, let's start with what is exactly transboundary conservation? What are the challenges? What are the opportunities for transboundary conservation in global environmental policy? So a brief story about myself. I did as Aish mentioned, I did my PhD, or as they call it in Oxford, DPhil, on leopards in between Iran and Turkmenistan. So I colored 6 leopards using satellite colors, and 2 of them actually passed the border from Iran into Turkmenistan. So basically, that was one of the first evidences I was aware of that these animals are moving across the border. So this one is a young male, which he left Iran, as you can see on this big map. If you follow my mouse, you can see here that the orange one is the national park where he was colored. All these red dots are the location of the leopard, which is basically each one is a GPS location. It went through all these villages, which are these triangles, past the border, this dotted line, and eventually it settled down in the other side of the border, basically in Turkmenistan. But he was forbidden to go further down into Turkmenistan because it was the border fence. So you know that the leopards are able to pass anywhere. So if a fence can stop a leopard, it means that it can stop anything. So that was basically, and if you look at the other map on the left, you can see the home range of this animal, which basically spans across 2 countries. And this is the border, which the black line is the border between 2 countries. So it was the first time I was thinking about, well, maybe it's not only about conservation to protect these animals, we need to think about another layer of conservation, and it's about transboundary conservation, which can be much more complicated because it's about multiple governments, not only about multiple communities, but a higher level of complexity. Transboundary conservation has enabled us to do lots of good things. So it has brought lots of challenges and also lots of opportunities. For example, here between Russia and China, you can see 2 charismatic species. And basically on Russian side, they have been protecting the tigers and leopards since at least 1970s. But they started to go back to be recovered actually on the Chinese side of the border. And you can see that the tigers are going back, the leopards are also going back. So basically, it's a transboundary recovery of a species, which has happening through the border. The other one is not that much good news, is about poaching. So you can see here the prevalence of a snare and illegal wildlife trade between Cambodia and Vietnam. So you can see here the prevalence of snares at the border between Vietnam and the Cambodian side is much higher than inner side of the Cambodia, which means that the poachers are basically people who are coming from the other country, getting the animal for the bushmeat and then going back to their own country. So if, let's say, a Vietnamese poacher is arrested in Cambodia, what should be done with that guy? Is that something that the persecution should be done in Vietnam or Cambodia? These are the things that make transboundary conservation a bit complicated. Now let's look at the Europe, the EU. If you look at the three large carnivores, the Eurasian lynx on the right, the brown bear in the middle, and the gray wolf on the left, you can see that all the wolf population are transboundary. Basically, they are shared between the countries. 8 to 10 population for the brown bears are transboundary. And for the lynx, almost all of the population for the lynx, Eurasian lynx, are transboundary, which means that it's many of these large cats or many of these issues are happening just at the border. So basically, it's not anymore in the power of only single government to protect them. It needs cooperation. For this one, you can see the different levels of law and legal protection for Southeast Asia, and it's for the leopards. So if you look at different animals, so it is Thailand, Myanmar, China, Laos. So the leopard was initially started to be protected by law in 1960 in Thailand. But until 1994, in other countries, in neighboring countries, in Cambodia, in Laos, it wasn't protected. So basically about more than 3 decades of gap in legal protection have resulted a difference in the life of the leopards. Now what we can see in terms of the leopard is the highest number of the leopards on the Thai part, but in Cambodia and Vietnam, most of them are gone. So you can see that even a single individual of an animal, when it passes the border, just in a few hundred meters, it's subject to two completely different legal systems. So that's another thing that we need to make sure. The other example is about a monitoring program. So this example is again for the Amur leopard, the Siberian leopard actually, which is shared between Russia and China. And you can see these are the location for the camera traps. The camera traps are actually tools which are set in the field to take a photo of the animals and then compare the spot patterns to see how many are they. So when the Chinese started to count the leopards, they come up with a number. Then the Russian did so, and they come up with a single number. But when they all pooled the number together and tried to come up with a single number of the whole entire ecosystem of the Amur's landscape between Russia and China, the estimation was about 20% down, lower than what each of them were actually expecting, which means that they were counting the same individual on either side of the border twice. So if we do not count the animals or monitor the animals which are transboundary together, it means that we are overestimating because the animals are moving and they are counted at least twice if there are only 2 countries engaged. But it's not only about the wildlife, it's about everything actually. For example, the Nile River, it passes through 11 African countries. And when in an arid landscape, we have water and river, it creates lots of lives. There are millions of people's lives who are dependent on water, and it's a shared river basin. So it started from Uganda in Tanzania, and then all the way goes to Cairo in Egypt. And you can see how this thing can cause issues. And we are now seeing in news that Ethiopia is trying, or Sudan is trying to build a dam, and now Egypt is not happy, obviously. So a shared resource, too many engagers, but eventually it's not only within one country, it needs to be considered globally. And that's the reason why we can see the number of papers and publications about transboundary conservation areas and transboundary conservation growing exponentially in recent years. So this is not a new resource, but I'm sure that if it carries on with the new updated data, it would go much higher. But there are opportunities and potential for transboundary conservation across the board. And if you look at this map in a paper which was published last 2 years ago in Nature Ecology and Evolution, they have been able to categorize the countries based on 4 axes. One is the number of species if 2 countries join together to protect them. The other one is feasibility index. Is that feasible if the 2 countries are not, or 2 countries are not in war, they have ceasefire, or they are happy, they are cooperating already. So how these two are interacting. So for example, if you look at Nepal, India, there's a high number of species that can be protected, but the feasibility index is not that much high. So you can see all this brown or orange color, which are in many parts of Asia and even African sub-Sahara, which means that they can protect them. I mean, the feasibility is low, but the number of species which can be protected is high. So that's something that we need to understand. Another opportunity for transboundary conservation is connectivity. So now we are discussing about we need to protect 30% of the land by 2030. Well, it's not only about having more protected areas, it's also about having them more connected. So connectivity is a key part of having all these targets. And if you look at this figure, you can see that there is a shorter distance between protected areas in Asia across the border rather than inside the border. So if you compare the protected areas across the border with the neighboring country, it's shorter, so which means that there is a higher connectivity than when you look at the internal. So that's a good thing, because that creates a field for cooperation, because the countries not only can increase the amount of land they are protecting, but also they can increase the connectivity as well. So this is the same, another part of that one as well. So you can see that there is a higher connectivity between protected areas across the borders. And no matter how big is the protected or how big is the country, it's a small one, medium one, or large one. It happens everywhere for all the Asian countries. So that's a good thing. But at the same time, it shows that there are too much land left across the border, which can help the countries to meet their commitment for 2030. So with all these challenges and opportunities, let's discuss about something else, which was one of the motives of thinking about transboundary conservation. And it was based on a book, which was published about one decade and a half ago, in 2008. And it was about the shadow ecology. So what is shadow ecology? It's a hidden environmental impact of a country from consuming resources that is originated in another country. So basically you think about, for example, logging. Logging is happening in country A, but it's used in country B. So basically the country is bearing all the costs environmentally, but the country B actually is not bearing any environmental cost. So basically it's not visible in country B, which is consuming. So it's the shadow ecology, or the shadows of consumption, but we are not really seeing what is the effect of what we are consuming, and it's affecting our ecological processes and environmental landscapes. So that was one of the motives. And then since then, there have been discussion about what is the value for transboundary conservation and why we should think about this conservation in our agenda. Well, as we mentioned, the transboundary conservation areas have greater ecological integrity, which is great for long-term survival of the species, obviously. The second one is for the migratory species. So we have many migratory species, especially birds or mammals, which are moving across the border. So they need protection all the way across the migratory routes. It has the potential to generate substantial sociocultural and economic benefits. For example, we can see it in Tanzania, Masai Mara, between Kenya, which these zebras and wildebeest they have their annual migration. So basically they are migrating the revenue generated from the tourism as well. So both countries are able to host the tourists to get money and to raise funds for the conservation and also for the local people as well. And it's called enhanced cooperation because and it's results in multiple benefits, because when you are thinking about cooperation at the protected area level, you need to understand what is exactly happening in the neighboring area, because you may share the same concern or problems that can have similar solutions. So these are all the values that we can think about transboundary conservation in a nutshell. So in summary, to define most environmental issues are now have this transboundary nature, and many have global scopes: climate change, biodiversity loss, drought, sandstorm, everything, many of these things, and of course including biodiversity conservation. And they can only be addressed effectively through international cooperation. One single country can't address most of these issues if big solutions are targeted. So that's the reason why we need to think about transboundary conservation. So now we know why transboundary conservation is important. What are some overall overview of the challenges and opportunities. Now the question is, what is exactly transboundary conservation? What is definition, and what type of transboundary conservation do we are thinking? So the definition of transboundary conservation has been evolved through the time. So what we are now agreeing on is that it's a process of cooperation to achieve conservation goals across one or more international boundaries. So that's what is IUCN as now suggesting as the definition of transboundary conservation. But initially, the question was that, do we have to include subnational boundaries as well? For example, let's say the United States, they have different laws at the federal level. So if we are thinking about the country between the United States, Canada, and Mexico, that's something. But how about all those 50-something states that may have their own law? So that's what has been argued for about 15 years. So initially in IUCN, the initial idea was that let's consider everything, including national and subnational boundaries as well as the scale of transboundary conservation. But nowadays, it's now confined. We acknowledge that the value of cooperation efforts is important at the subnational boundaries, but in 2015, the global definition is now limit the concept of transboundary conservation just to international boundaries. So basically, we are thinking about a player, which is a government or a country. So we're not talking about within the country, it's just between the states and the governments. But there are two key elements in this definition, which I want to highlight it more specifically. And the key elements in transboundary conservation are basically cooperation and then land. So we need to achieve something for the land, which is basically conservation achievement, but it needs to go through a cooperation. So basically, there are the two key elements for transboundary conservation. And I have chosen this snow leopard because it's a classic example of transboundary big cat. It's moving between 12 or 13 Central and South Asian countries in mountainous landscapes. So let's now focus on cooperation, the first key element in transboundary conservation. What do we exactly mean by cooperation? What are the levels? So cooperation implies transboundary cooperation for conservation of various kinds. And it can be a minimum, for example, just regular communication, information sharing, or it can be just to joint implementation of decision or joint management planning. So it can go all the way from the low level to the high level. And it really depends not on us as people who are active in the sector of conservation. It's mostly affected by the geopolitical status of the countries, their international relations between the neighbors. So that's not really within our hand. We are just trying to use and best use of what is exactly available in those situations. So there are 4 different levels of cooperation or models for different cooperation in transboundary conservation. So the first one, which is more usual, and it's mostly at our level, at a scholar level, people who are working in science and conservation. It's communication, information sharing. We just share information that, okay, I have seen this leopard on this side of the border, and I have the photo. You can, and if you have a photo of your leopard on your side, we can just share the photo to see if they are the same or not. Or we can see if for example, these animals are migrating from this side, these birds are coming from this pond to the pond on your side. Just share information to see what's happening. What we are not waiting really for a feedback. If we are make it for a feedback, we want to decide on a harmonized management, that's consultation, that's the next level. So basically we are sharing information, but we are seeking information, opinion and feedback and advice from the other side. We are thinking about, well, we know that there's a problem or there's an issue. How we can join forces to address that issue. So that's the other level. The third level is coordinated action. So basically, each of us decide on our action, but we just try to make it coordinated. For example, we want to think about elephants which are moving across the border, and on each side of the border they are causing conflict with people across the forest, or for example Rohingya people which are refugee people. So we are on either side of the border, we are just sharing information and then trying to say, okay, on this side of the border we are trying to address the conflict in this way, and then they are also doing their own way, but we are aware of what is happening on the other side, but we are not basically waiting for their, for their decision. We are just sharing what we are doing. So it's not only sharing about what is happening, it's sharing about what we are doing. We are planning to do so as well. And eventually it's the joint implementation of decision. So basically it's the join together, share information, share the decision, make a decision together, and then try to implement it. And it's rather difficult because, for example, let's say we want to address illegal wildlife trade, and it needs people like rangers to stop poachers from going into the area. It means that we need to have 2 rangers from one country, 2 rangers from another one, having sit in a single car, patrolling one area. But it's not really easy in many of the landscape, at least in Asia, because we know that the situation is a bit different than Africa. So we can see that there are 4 different levels. And I think in Asia, most of the time, we are just at level 1 or 2. We do communication, and sometimes we might be able to do consultation. We rarely go higher, because at the highest level, we need countries, actually we need international NGOs like the UN or the CBD or transnational NGOs to play a part, so they can coordinate this action between the 2 players. And we rarely have them. So the second part of transboundary conservation is cooperation, but cooperation over what? Is the land, is the magic word of the land. So with land, basically, if we are having issues between the governments, for example, land dispute, it's not easy to convince them to cooperate over conservation. If we have 2 countries which are, for example, effectively in war or not in peace, basically it's not easy to convince them for cooperation. So the land is eventually the magical word which determines most of these actions in transboundary conservation. If the land is properly delineated by each country, if each of them are aware of the borders, are accepting the borders, and in that way we can think about, well, let's do some conservation action as well. So with land, if we consider the land, there are 3 or actually 4 types of transboundary conservation areas. The first one is just a straightforward one, transboundary protected area. So you can see here 3 countries, country A, B, and C, and each of them have their own protected area. And the protected areas are just at the border. So basically they are shaping a larger protected area, which is called transboundary protected area. So in that way, it's much easier to share information, to implement actions, everything. So basically it's consisting of ecologically connected, protected areas across transboundary international boundaries. The second one is that, again, we have multiple countries. They have their own protected areas, but there are multiple resource use areas in between. So basically, the protected areas are not exactly at the border. They have some distance. And in this gap between, we have people, villagers, farmland, everything, roads, mines, whatever, humans, actually, which are actively working and living there and consuming the resources. But it doesn't mean that we can't do transboundary conservation. We are now on the second level or second type of the transboundary conservation area, which is called transboundary conservation landscape or seascape. So basically it's not protected area, it's just conservation landscape. And it's a combination of ecologically connected areas which sustain, these multiple land use areas across the border. So again, it has more role for the people and communities as well. The third one is about migration, so transboundary migration conservation areas. So in this way, we might have countries which are not essentially, but in some cases are not bordering each other. They have the host or the habitat for the species which hosting the animal for a particular time of the year. And in that way, we have, and altogether, they are sustaining a population of that migratory species. So you can see here the migration route between country C and A, and there are stopovers in country B. So basically, all of them are shaping together the transboundary conservation areas. So just to give you an example of the size of these types of the landscape, for example, in East Asian flyway for the birds, it's coming all the way from northern Russia to Australia. So it can be huge. It can engage dozens of the countries. And eventually, the fourth type of transboundary conservation is the Park for Peace. So basically, the Park for Peace was one of the initial motivation for thinking about transboundary conservation. So basically, is to use conservation to promote peace between the countries. And I think Aish has published a good paper about using this peace park in South Asia and across the Asia as well. So it's dedicated to promotion, celebration of peace and cooperation in the name of conservation of nature. So that's another one. So these are the four types of transboundary conservation. If they are joining together, if they have some multiple use landscape in between, if they are flyways or migratory landscape, or it's the goal is not only for conservation, it's also for the peace. But thinking about all these is causing us to think about, well, are we trained enough to think about transboundary conservation? We are conservation biologists. We know how to save species, population, habitats. We know what is the behavior of the animals. These are the disciplines that more or less we are familiar. But it needs more discipline to be engaged. For example, international relations. International relations is a discipline to discuss the relationship between the governments and the countries. And transboundary conservation is essentially, it's very related to international relations. Law, international law. If we want to save the planet from climate change, what is exactly the international law to play? Is the law within the country? One country is enough, or we have more countries included, or at the international level? Health. I think the health issue is becoming a major issue in transboundary conservation. It's not only for conservation of the wildlife, for people as well. And now we have the concern over dogs, the free-ranging dogs in many South and West Asian countries. They are just blooming in numbers. And when you can think about multiple countries just neighboring each other, for example, in Pakistan, India, think about your neighbor. I think last summer they called tens of thousands of dogs. And in India, I think the calling program is not part of this management plan. So thinking about one country which is calling, the other one which is not calling. Basically, if they are not working together, it's not really helping a lot, because the dogs, which are basically the most abundant carnivore nowadays in many parts of the world, can just pop in across the border. So the health issue is another one which we need to think about for this transboundary conservation. But it has been always considered as a process of top-down. So basically, international organization approaching the governments, convincing them, well, let's protect such a huge area, but not only on yourself, with your neighbor. And that was some sort of top-down. And we need to now come up with bottom-up, because now we need to engage people, communities, the people whose life would be affected by the actions. The third objective of this talk is about the history of transboundary conservation, how it started, and what are the stories behind this, which it's pretty amazing. So basically, transboundary conservation has been existing as long as protected areas were there. And this is between Canada and the United States. Canada's Waterton National Park, which was established in 1895, and the Glacier National Park across the border in 1910. And in 1932, they became the first international peace park. So basically, the first peace park was based between two countries which were less in war. So you can see how long it can go back to see the concept of engaging peace into conservation. So it was in 1932, before the World War II, that this peace park was established. It's now so basically now we have about a century of history for these actions. The other one is for the migration. So basically that's Canadian thing was between two countries. So basically that's for the transboundary protected area. But how about these migration? So the Migratory Bird Treaty Act was signed between the United States and Great Britain in 1916. So that was for the game birds, which are moving across the Atlantic. So they could protect them all the way in this migration route. So it was for to stop hunting for them, and also to establish specific hunting seasons for game birds. So that was the first one, about 1916. So it's about a century ago. The other one is the Lacey Act. So the Lacey Act it's covered illegal wildlife trade, and it's very connected to the CITES, the International Trade in Endangered Species of Wild Fauna and Flora. And then, so basically it became the first, the Lacey Act in 1900, when it was passed, it became the first federal law protecting wildlife. And it includes transboundary trade as well. So that was actually the first international law which addressed transboundary conservation in terms of the legal coverage. So now with this law and the history and the background, now let's think about more non-conservation thing and how it's connected to our work. And one of them is neoliberalization and conservation. So one of the processes which is popularly associated with neoliberalization is deregulation. So basically the scaling back of the states and their capacity to regulate. So what does that mean? It means that we have governments, and there is a corruption in the governments because they are inefficient. The free trade, free assembly, free speech, free press, they are not available with the government and the states. So with neoliberalization, we need to go back in a way that we reduce the power of the central governments, give more power to non-governmental organizations like the NGOs, and in that way try to control the market and at the same time make sure that there is free speech and democracy and free press for everyone. So how is that connected to conservation? It seems something very political for international relations, how we have been benefiting basically from this thing. So the logic is that this neoliberalization was spiked in 1980s and 1990s. So in these countries, they aim for a vibrant NGO sector and the private enterprise as a solution to these problems. So have reduced power in the central governments and more power in non-governmental players. So two broad trends characterize these neoliberal forms of environmental governance. And that's why we have more transboundary conservation nowadays. The one is a shift in responsibilities for managing nature from state to non-state actors. And they can be NGO, they can be international treaties, they can be United Nations, transnational NGOs, whatever. So basically in that way, it's not only the government who has all the power, it's all multiple players at high level. And the other one is the use of market-based mechanisms, such as ecotourism and rationalities to manage the environment. So basically to make money out of the environment and in a market-based mechanism. So in these two ways, that have been one of the key foundation for shaping of these transboundary environmental governance. So for example, in Southern Africa, up to 2000, most of the funding which was available for conservation mostly was for community conservation. But since then, as we can see the spike of neoliberalization, we can see that in early 2000, we can see it has been shifted from community conservation to transfrontier, or as we call it, transboundary conservation. And in this new brand, most of this conservation or development intervention and funding, they mandate the governments to have interstate cooperation, so which is part of this wider shift in neoliberal politics. Working and the neoliberalization is mostly about cooperation between the states, within the states, between different players, and also thinking about how to make money at the same time as well. So you can see that the shift in funding and attention was happening from the community conservation about 2 decades ago to transboundary conservation, as we can see this shift into the neoliberalization across the world. And one of the classic examples was this Transfrontier National Park in Southern Africa, the Kigali, which was launched in 2000 by the president of Botswana and South Africa. And it's a huge area to protect ungulates and their predators and facilitate the movement of tourists. So basically, these are the areas which if you visit, you don't need to get a visa for the country, you can get the visa for that area. So that's a different system. So so basically you can see the engagement of two trends of neoliberalization: market-based ecotourism, which has promoting here, and also cooperation between the NGOs and the governments and everyone. So that was shaped well in Southern Africa. But there's another difference when we are thinking about transboundary conservation. So unlike national park, which the emphasis is only on the species protection within the border of the national park, in transboundary conservation, it promotes conservation beyond the border of the protected areas, because we have transboundary conservation areas and landscapes. So basically we have multiple land use. So for that reason, this mega conservation initiative, they encourage multiple land use, rural livelihood, and also at the same time biodiversity conservation. For example, a classic example is the Kaza-Kavango Zambezi Transfrontier Conservation Area, which is shared between 5 countries in Namibia, Angola, Botswana, Zambia, and Zimbabwe, and South Africa, in Southern Africa. And you can see that there are different types of the land use. The green ones are the national parks, and the yellow ones are multiple land use. So basically, they are promoting a combination of different land use and protected area, and at the same time, coexistence models between these things. But there are some criticism against these things. For example, this paper, which has been published by people from Zimbabwe, in another transfrontier national park between Botswana, South Africa, and Zimbabwe, it has been rationalized that conservation sector was trying to promote transboundary conservation in the way to promote multiple land use. So that could be used as an excuse to grab more land for conservation. So basically saying that it's fine to have multiple land use, but at the same time, making sure that those lands are available for movement of the elephants or the animals or whatever. So basically that has been used as an excuse. So this is the criticism that has been addressed to our transboundary conservation. So on my final part of my today talk, I will be briefly covering the international treaties and conventions for transboundary conservation. So the most important one is the Bonn Convention on the Conservation of Migratory Species of Wild Animals, which is under the UNEP. So basically that was for migratory species. It was signed initially in 1979, about 40-something years ago. And it was aimed for migratory species. So you can think about 4 different types of transboundary landscapes. One of them was transboundary migratory landscapes. So it was aiming only for one of them, for migratory species. And migratory species are those who are predictably crossing one or more international borders. So we can expect where to see them at each time of the year. For example, birds in summer, they are in this country, but they are wintering in the other country, and it's predictable. But through the time, it has been evolved into an instrument focusing on the conservation of migratory and transboundary species. So it's not only about migratory, it's now covering many of these transboundary conservation as well, which means that when we are thinking about transboundary, they are not predictable anymore. A tiger or an elephant can be on this side of the border anytime and then decide to go back on the other side. So it's not predictable by us in most of the time. So that's the key instrument. The other one is the Convention on Biological Diversity. There's the CBD. And the CBD has its own strategic plans, which is mostly, it's not explicitly for transboundary conservation, but it advocates for cooperation and coordinated effort, which is actually a key part in transboundary conservation, but at the same time making sure there is ecological connectivity within the species range and among these nation states. So basically it is using the terms which is fundamental to transboundary conservation, which means that the transboundary conservation would be inevitable in the commitments which are promoted by the CBD. And it's cooperation and it's the connectivity, or basically the land, if you remember those 2 terms which are embedded in transboundary conservation. So with this brief overview of the treaties, I just want to have a final overview of what we discussed today. We started with transboundary conservation as an emerging field, where the challenges, we found different types of transboundary movement, like the recovery, snare prevalence, bushmeat hunting, monitoring all this stuff across the border. Then we went to define the transboundary conservation, different levels of cooperation, which were 4 levels, and the typology, which were 3 types of transboundary conservation plus peace park. Then we covered the history, how it was engaged with political movement, neoliberalization, and the international relations. And eventually, we briefly covered the 2 key treaties which are available and conventions which are available: the CBD and Convention of Migratory Species, or the Bonn Convention, which are promoting transboundary conservation. So I have provided a list of reading if you are more interested in having more read about this topic, which is an emerging field in conservation science. And I am happy to take any question if there is. Thank you.
Excellent, very engaging, and a very thoughtful, excellent presentation. Thank you so much. So dear participants, we are now open for the Q&A. I do have some questions in my chat box, but before I move to that, I would give this opportunity to all our participants to please ask your questions directly. I think first question is coming from Dr. Kaushal. Yeah, please.
Yeah, good evening to all. I have a query. What is the future of transboundary conservation in the present scenario, and how do you look at the Russian-Ukraine war in particular?
Sorry, yeah, I could not hear it properly. Can you say it again?
Yeah. So what his question is, he's asking about particularly in the case of the that was inevitable, I would say, Russian-Ukrainian war in particularly.
Okay.
How do you look at the transboundary conservation initiatives?
Okay. So when there is a land dispute between 2 countries, it's not really easy to think about transboundary conservation, because first the countries need to resolve the issue of the land, who owns the land. And we know that transboundary conservation is very focused on the land. So first we need to know who owns the land. And then we can think about who wants to manage that land. So I don't say that there are no way to promote transboundary conservation even within the war zone, but that's one of the challenges, the big challenges. So in this case, we know that the land dispute would be perhaps there for many years, maybe even beyond our life. But the issue is that I think if we have another issue in these areas, and that's the war and political conflict and unrest. So if we consider border at the same time with the war sometimes promotes conservation in a way not to allow people to shoot or kill the animals, or not allow the companies to extract the resources. So now we can see that there are many wars after the war that are basically a heaven for the wildlife. And one of the good examples is between Armenia and Azerbaijan, and between these 2 countries, which has been effectively in war on ceasefire in periodical situation since 1990. There has been a recovery of the leopards, their prey, and now they are investing more in other areas to expand that protection. So it's really difficult to say what would be the implication, but I would say it's not easy to expect the Russian and Ukrainian to sit together to collaborate on these things. But maybe this political unrest would provide an opportunity for the wildlife for recovery if there is anything within those areas. But obviously,
exactly.
Obviously, it's not the great thing for humans as well. It's costing too many lives.
Certainly, and in such scenario, the priorities of a nation bend towards the land security and their human security on priority. Exactly.
Yes. Yeah.
Yeah. The next question, Dr. Gupta, please.
Good evening, sir. This is Dr. Arbind Gupta from National Resource Management. Sir, how effective the conservation consortium in transboundary wildlife conservation?
Sorry, again, it was a bit dropped to your line. Can you say your question?
Is it clear, sir?
Yeah, just let me read it for you. He's asking, where is it? Yeah. So how effective the conservation consortium, like the treaties, and I think you covered up at the last of your slides, in transboundary wildlife conservation? Are they really effective, do you think?
Yeah, that's a very good question, actually. So we are, I think it's a general, skepticism towards the international treaties and how they can, convince the government to work together. And I think it's essentially the governments who should be able to make a decision if they want to do anything across the board with their neighbors or not. So if there is no willingness in the government, it's hardly, convincible from someone from the outside, like these conservation consortiums. So you are right. I think it's not easy, but at the same time, I would consider this in a counterfactual way if we don't have them, and if without having them, it means that we don't have any way to at least work toward the first layer of cooperation, which is just information sharing or communication. So most of these things are happening through these international, platforms. So that's the basic things. And without having them, we can't think about the higher levels. But at the same time, it's eventually in the hands of the government if they want to cooperate or not. So it's not easy. Yeah.
Exactly. There is one last question, and I think that is by Mr. Khan, Dr. Khan. He is asking how much it is feasible to monitor wildlife population across the international borders, particularly in case of such countries where they do not have harmonious political relationships. So that is a valid question, I would say.
Yes. I think if we were about 15 or 20 years ago, we could not think about joint monitoring. Now it's much easier, and it's because of the technology which is available. So basically, it can be done through the remote sensing or through these satellite tags. So these satellite tags are basically, the server is not within either of those countries, it's somewhere else. So basically, that allows you to monitor the species. And that was exactly what I did during my PhD, which I colored the leopard. So basically, the Turkmenistan has built a fence on the Iranian side, and not on the Iranian side, but on most of the neighbor side. So basically, I could not see any cooperation between the two countries, but basically the leopard was moving across the border and showing with the color that he's moving, and he has established a territory on the other side. So I think with this technology, it's now much more feasible to do so. And also with the remote sensing, for example, with the movement of the big mammals like elephants or the birds across the ponds. So that's another way we can think about. But without technology, I think no, there is no way at this time to think about this time. Other than just talking to each other and having cooperation, which sometimes, as you mentioned, is not easy with this politically difficult situation.
Exactly. So joint foot patrolling may not be, easy and may not be feasible, but by using the genetic tools and the satellite telemetry, as we have seen in between Mongolia and Russia, India and Nepal, there are substantial evidence to prove that. So one more question Dr. Swapna has asked, that was not from the wildlife, but she is asking, conservation of soils and water can also be done this way?
Yes. Yeah. So I think the water is one of the tricky things and politically sensitive thing when we are thinking about transboundary conservation, because it's not only about conservation of the species, it's about the conservation of the nature and natural resources, including water. So yes, that's something we can think about, and I think in many countries it's the only way is to think about transboundary conservation of the water, because we have the water and the rivers as the border in many countries. So that's something we need to think about.
Great. So I guess that's what the question here I can see in the chat box. So with this, on behalf of the organizing committee and my own behalf, the Bandha University of Agriculture and Technology duly acknowledge and express the sincere gratitude to you, Dr. Mohammad, for providing really insightful and an incredible session on the geopolitics. And we really thank you so much. And we wish you all the very best for your future endeavors. And we look forward to your similar kind of cooperation and guidance for our upcoming, academic programs. So thank you so very much.
Thank you, and thank you for having me. Yeah, have a nice evening. Bye.
Yeah, you too. Thank you. Bye. Yeah, you may just, yeah, great. I'll just have a chat with the. Yeah, great. So that was about the geopolitics and of today. So we have actually finally worked out the tomorrow session. So there will be 2 sessions tomorrow because geopolitics was actually falling in between the the festival of holy holidays. So we have actually preponed it. One lecture we have adjusted here, and another lecture will be adjusted for tomorrow. But rest assured, as committed and promised earlier, there will be only 2 lectures for tomorrow. So we will send you the details of tomorrow's lecture. There will be 2. One, of course, I would be giving on geopolitics, and the third poll, a role in the wildlife conservation, and another one on the using the advanced tools in the wildlife sciences by Dr. K. Ramesh, who was also here today. So with these words, if you have any question, you may please ask them now. And I will be sending an email to all of you, because now we are finalizing the minute-to-minute program for the valedictory session. So we really want to have all of you have come aboard. And please, of course, the feedback form would be sent to you at the end of the last day or the last session. But on the validity section particularly, we really want your valuable feedback in the form of the sort of speech or the points which you would like to mention. So please do volunteer and respond positively. So we really solicit for your timely and positive response on the feedback email which we will be sending for the valedictory session. So if any of you have any question, please, you can ask them now, and then I will end for today. Nothing? As usual? All right. Thank you very much and have a great evening. Bye.